Okay, so here we go with a taxonomy of fake news. We're going to parse out all of the different kinds of things that we're talking about when we use the term fake news. So fake news is not a new concept. It's been around even within United States journalism since at least the Spanish-American War, when misleading newspaper headlines and often actually fabricated newspaper headlines were used to basically move the United States into war with Spain. But it has captured the American consciousness considerably over the last few years since the presidential candidacy and since presidency of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump likes to talk about fake news. In this example, he says any negative polls are fake news, just like the CNN, ABC, NBC polls in the election. The problem is you can't just say that anything you don't like is fake news. That is not how any of this works. So how does it work? We are now going to find out. So I'm going to talk today about 4 different categories of fake news. The first of these is satire, which differs from the others in that it is not intended to be taken seriously, right? So satire is the use of humorous exaggeration or irony to make a rhetorical point. It's not just, real satire is not just being funny for funny's sake, it's kind of making a larger point about society or satirizing something. There are some pretty well-known purveyors of satire on the internet, but even though it's well known that some of these sites are fictional and fake and satirical, people still fall for it on the reg. So for example, Clickhole is a site that specializes in things that are supposed to sound like clickbait. Fighting back, Facebook is mailing air horns to all of its users to blow whenever they see fake news. To most of us, this looks obviously silly and is a satire on Facebook's terrible actions and inaction about fighting the fake news problem. But you still have people who want to say things like, so who decides if news is fake? Zuckerberg? No thanks. If I can't tell if something is fake or not, it's my fault for being an idiot. This is just fake newsception here, right? Your fault for being an idiot. Right. Anyway, so that's one example of people falling for a clickhole. Here's another one. Thousands turn out for Empire State Building's annual no hassle suicide date. This is from The Onion, perhaps the most well-known satirical publication. There are entire blogs dedicated to people who take The Onion seriously by mistake. So what is wild about this is that you actually see people trying to figure out whether things are real or not using their information literacy skills. So it's not just credibly because I read it on the internet. M, as you can see on the bottom here, when someone says, is this for real, says, I would think so, check the link, it has the date and everything where it came from. And this is really kind of sad because this person is clearly trying to do their due diligence and they just don't have the toolkit to recognize that, first of all, The Onion is satire, and second of all, that there are more indicators than just there being a date and something looking like a news story. Here we have a fabulous example. The satirical piece, Lonely Teacher, Outcast Student, begins somewhat endearing sexual relationship. Somebody took that seriously, and then as you can see down here, P is trying to convince N that they should not be taking this seriously. First says, it's The Onion, silly. And this person says, I don't think so, read the article. P goes to the trouble of explaining it's a joke newspaper, and then N says, okay, well, that is your opinion. Where do we go from here? What do we do with this? This is some stuff that we'll talk about. We'll talk about in the next video, or try to. Anyway, here is yet another example. J.K. Rowling revealed to be a pseudonym for Newt Gingrich. This person says, I hope this proves to be true since I shared this. So they don't even check, they just share it and then stop to think, wait, is this true or not? Once again, this person is actually called out. This person says, The Onion is a satirical magazine, so it probably isn't. And then A decides to double down and says, actually, more evidence is coming out about it. Time will tell. Somebody else chimes in to say, it is from The Onion, it is not true, it's entertainment. And then A gives us the coup de grace here. Even satire can be truth, just masked truth, like a lie. Can we ever really be sure? Satan has many deceptions. So what we're seeing emerging here is that even when people are working with satire, even when people are working with satire and know that they're working with satire, there is still this urge to believe that it's true, even if it has been demonstrated to be false, which is concerning. The New Yorker has a satirical column called the Borowitz Report. This is obviously not a fake headline. This is what Borowitz Report columns used to look like when they got shared. But people were sharing them and thinking they were true because people think New Yorker. New Yorker is a reputable source. They didn't realize that Andy Borowitz writes the satirical column. And so eventually the New Yorker actually changed the way it labels these things. So now it says the Borowitz Report, not the news, so people don't get confused. So that is satire. On to our next category of fake news, which is reporting errors. So reporting errors happen all the time. These are unintentional factual errors, maybe because of sloppy journalism, maybe just because the journalist made a mistake. Usually, these are officially corrected by the publication. All the time, when you get to the bottom of a news article, you'll see correction. We originally had this person's name wrong, or correction. We were informed that it was this, but later found out that it was this, right? So there was an incident in 2017, during the inauguration, when journalist Zeke Miller looked around the Oval Office and thought that Trump had removed the MLK bust and tweeted about it when he was doing his coverage, and then tweeted a retraction afterward saying that actually, wait, it turns out that it is there. Sorry, I made a mistake. You probably can't read this, it's very small. But it says that once he realized his mistake, he sent a bunch of emails and he sent a bunch of tweets taking responsibility. But nevertheless, the president in the White House, this says, has cited this mistake as an example of deliberately false reporting. It was a mistake. This is a statement from the outlet that Zeke Miller worked for. It is not deliberately false reporting. It is just a mistake that happened. Mistakes like this happen all the time. It's very common. And combining them with this idea of deliberately falsified news is a problem because it assigns intent that is not necessarily there. Here's another example. That's what I would call a journalistic mistake. Here's an example of sloppy reporting. So after the Parkland shooting, a whole bunch of headlines came out linking the gunman Nicholas Cruz to a white supremacist group. Here are a bunch from Time, from Uproxx. Alleged gunman Nicholas Cruz was in white supremacist group. Parkland suspect Nicholas Cruz, member of white nationalist militia. Nicholas Cruz was a member of a white nationalist militia in Florida. This is big news, right? If you go look at the actual local paper, it says Florida white supremacist group admits ties to alleged Parkland school shooter Nicholas Cruz. This is different from saying he was a member, right? This is saying that the group admits ties. Now, admits is still pretty loaded, but this is a very different headline from he was a member of this group. But then if you see what the actual story is, it turns out that somebody from the white supremacist group simply told the news that Nicholas Cruz was a member of their group, just to mess with the press. And so all of these outlets that jumped to these conclusions and overstated their case in the headlines were actually spreading falsehoods. If you look at the AP, at the Associated Press headline on that, it says Parkland suspect Nicholas Cruz, member of white nationalist militia group's leader, says. So this is actually not only the most sort of modulated, slow-rolled headline. It's not looking for clicks, right? It's specifically saying that the group's leader says that this is the case. This is the only one of these headlines that I would say is not misrepresenting what actually happened. This came out before it came out that the group was trolling. But even after the group admitted it was trolling, this headline is still true because the AP was really careful in the way that they wrote it. So that is reporting errors. The third thing is, I think, what we often think of as fake news, that is disinformation. So false stories purposely manufactured to gain profit or influence. This can come from a lot of different places for a lot of different reasons. There was, when Black Panther came out, there was a rash of white women or people posing as white women claiming to have been attacked by African Americans when they were going to see Black Panther. This one says people told her that whites weren't allowed to watch the movie. This one says a black teenager shouted, "You at the wrong theater," and smashed a bottle on this person's face. This one says that somebody's wife was assaulted by some black women and said the movie isn't for white bitches. None of these actually happened. A lot of these pictures can be traced to other sources, other incidents that people posted online, but were being associated with this, possibly so that people could get attention or notoriety, and possibly also just to stir up racial ill feeling. Other examples of ways that deliberate misinformation circulates are headlines like this, saying that Denzel Washington had backed Trump in the 2016 election. He had not. But Denzel Washington backing Trump as fake news does seem to imply that prominent Black Americans, even though people were accusing Trump of being racist, that prominent Black Americans were backing him, even among the Hollywood elite, right? So this story got 10,000 shares in 6 hours. And spread all over Facebook. Similarly, we have a story about claiming that the Pope backed Trump. This also got a lot of play. An article saying that Hillary didn't win the popular vote. She did. An article saying that after the election, Obama signed an executive order declaring an investigation and revote. This looks super legit, right? ABC News, that is a site that we all know, but if you go up close and you look at this had 200.1 million Facebook engagements. If you go up close and look, it says abcnews.com.co. They've really cleverly aped the ABC News website, and you'd have to look pretty closely to see that this is the case. You also can Google and see if other people are covering it. That's going to be a pretty big clue in as well. So where does this disinformation come from? Sometimes it comes from people who just want to mess with people. Sometimes it comes from Americans who have sites that they know they can make a lot of money if they get a lot of clicks. That's what clickbait is, right? So it doesn't have to be real, and it can be easily debunkable. But as soon as people click on it, then they're making their money. But there are also entire town economies that are built on producing fake news. There's a town in Macedonia where everybody in the town just hangs out in warehouses and creates fake news stories. So here's some more examples of some fake news coming out of places like that. And what's interesting, well, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is so we know that there are people who are just producing this content on purpose to mess with us, but it still doesn't stop us. Um, as this article says, the goal isn't to help one side or the other of the gun control debate win, it's to amplify the loudest voices in that fight, deepening the divisions between us. So this person argues that the bots are doing their job as long as they're increasing polarization in America. And it's not always obvious, right? It's not always going to be accounts that say things like Trump endorsed by Pope. Here are some examples of some accounts that were found to be run by these sort of fake news content farms in Eastern Europe. So we have an entire Facebook group. So being patriotic with anti-Black Lives Matter stuff. We have a Blacktivist site saying that, talking about the Black Panther history. And then you've got LGBT United with a Bernie coloring book that they've reposted here. So you cannot be sure that something that you follow is necessarily originating in the United States or even has your best interest at heart, which is pretty wild. From that article that I was quoting earlier, there's a professor who calls this moral contagion, saying, referring to the use of moral emotional language to help content go viral on social networks. He says, tugging at those emotions tends to drive people deeper into ideological echo chambers, which is what happens when you have Russian, which is what these Russian bots and Russian ads are trying to do. And it is not limited to one side or the other. I saw this personally shared a whole bunch of times on my timeline in 2017. This was a story that says Trump's unsecured Android device, source of recent White House leaks. I immediately saw that something was up with this, even though, actually, I think I bought it for half a second. But I'm from Seattle, and there is no newspaper called the Seattle Tribune. But if you were to click through to that article, it actually looks pretty legitimate. Actually, since this was recorded, or since this PowerPoint was made, there actually isn't even, I don't believe, a website for that anymore. It got taken down. So, okay, all right, we've now hit 3. We've hit satire, reporting errors, deliberate misinformation. Now we have bias and distortion, which are stories in which the facts are framed, spun, or misrepresented to support a particular viewpoint. Let's not pretend that there is such a thing as an unbiased report, right? So if I like to use this example, if we look at this picture, think about what you would say this picture is of. Is this a picture of a lake with a cabin on it? Is it a picture of mountains with a cabin? Is it a cabin on a lake? Is it a landscape scene? Is it a winter scene? All of these are correct descriptions, but because our language works linearly, we have to pick something to go first. Something receives that emphasis. So there is no such thing as true unbiased reporting. That being said, things can be more and less biased and take more and less effort to counteract the bias of what they're doing. So, okay, here are a couple of news stories that I attempted to get to the bottom of to figure out, or that I sort of uncovered bias in when I was clicking through to find the primary sources. So this was a pretty inflammatory headline. Trump thinks only Black people are on welfare, but really white Americans receive most benefits. So this is a screenshot from the NBC article where I found this. President Donald Trump was apparently unaware that not all, in fact, the vast majority of welfare beneficiaries are not Black as recently as last March, according to a new report. In the spring of 2017, the newly elected president met with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. During that meeting, one of the members mentioned to Trump that welfare reform would be detrimental to her constituents, adding, "not all of whom are Black," according to NBC News. The president was incredulous. Really? Then what are they? Okay, so I tried to get as close as I could to the actual transcript of this interaction, and I couldn't find it. So this is the closest to a primary source that we have. But I do not find that this actually implies that Trump was not aware that welfare beneficiaries, welfare beneficiaries are not Black. To me, it looks like he was talking to a member of the Black Caucus who said that her constituents are not all Black, and he got confused about what the Black Caucus means and thought that she meant that all of her constituents are Black, not that all welfare recipients are Black. To me, it just seems like a miscommunication, but it was being represented in such a way that made it seem like he thought everybody on welfare was Black. Here's another example. This hit a lot of headlines in 2017, saying that Betsy DeVos says that guns should be allowed in schools. They might be needed to shoot grizzlies. What actually happened there was she was trying to say that it should be a state-by-state event, a state-by-state choice whether guns should be allowed in schools. And she referred to an actual earlier event where a school had put up a fence because they needed to protect the students from wildlife. And she said, I guess a school like that has that kind of problem, I would imagine there's probably a gun in the school to protect from potential grizzlies. So this got taken and spun to make it sound like she thought that every elementary school in Brooklyn needed a gun or was trying to say that every elementary school anywhere needed a gun to protect from grizzlies, which is not what was happening at all. So these are examples of, I think, sort of unethically biased spins on stories that distort the actual meaning of what's going on. Here's another example here. This GIF was tweeted out in 2017, and got a pretty strong response. It appears to show President Trump feeding the koi with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and while they were supposed to be using spoons delicately to dump things in, Trump just dumps his whole box like that, and it makes him seem like some kind of toddler. If we go to the full zoom out, though, we can see that actually Prime Minister Abe dumps his entire box out first, and only then does Trump. I mean, perhaps less gracefully, but he is following the Prime Minister's lead right there. If you recall, the version that we saw before this was zoomed in really tight to deliberately avoid showing Abe dumping his own fish food. So pretty deceptive practice right there. Here is one of several breakdowns of the bias and distortion in different news sites and sources. Do, of course, remember that the people that are making these also have their own levels of bias and distortion. This one ranks not only, it goes from garbage left to garbage right and high quality to poor quality. The worst of all is InfoWars, which, just in case you don't know, is an actual conspiracy theory site that has led to, if you haven't heard of Pizzagate, please look up Pizzagate. InfoWars was instrumental in almost getting somebody shot based on their false news. So here's one version of this breakdown. Here's another. There are tons all over the internet. But again, do recall that these are being made by people that have their own biases as well. So once again, our categories of fake news are satire, reporting errors, deliberate misinformation, and bias and distortion. And I actually would encourage us to try and get away from the term fake news if we can, because I think that it contributes, that using it as a catch-all term contributes to this idea that you can just take anything that seems even the least bit biased and go ahead and slap it with the label fake just because you don't like it. So we don't want to return to this idea that a bad poll is fake news. So this was long and I'm sorry, but we're only halfway there and have miles to go before we sleep.